I want to talk about my absolute favorite character in the entire Jurassic franchise, and that's Dr. Ian Malcolm, played by Jeff Goldblum. And in my opinion, this is not only his best role he's ever had, period, but he always says these interesting things, like all throughout the movies. He's always, in my opinion, the smartest character there, even if he's a little bit arrogant at times. Yeah. But here's the thing. As much attention as Dominion has gotten, as much as we're all talking about it, nobody is paying attention to what was, in my opinion, one of the most important scenes in the movie. And it's actually a scene where he first shows up, and he's at Biosyn Industries, and I think this occurs at roughly the 45 to 50 minute mark, pretty sure. And what he's doing is he's talking to all of these young scientists working at Biosyn, and he's in a lecture hall and he's trying to warn them. He starts by telling them about, you, the viewer, only come in like towards the end of the lecture, and he warns them. He talks about atomic fusion, and he says, we didn't know what would happen when we split the atom. We had no idea what would happen when we dropped the bomb. He said, but what did we do? He said, we pushed the button anyway, just to see what would happen. He said, look at the chaos and devastation we created. He said, unintended perhaps. He said, but consequences don't care about whether or not you intended or not. They just happen, and you're left to deal with the fallout. In the case of Nagasaki, quite literally. And what does he do? He's talking about the work at Biosyn. He says, think about it. He said, genetic research. He said, you're thinking that you're pioneering the future of mankind. He said, it's a whole new field of science nobody's touched. He said, but are you thinking about what you're unleashing upon our world? He said, are you thinking about the millions of unintended consequences that could arise from this? He says, no, you're just hitting the button. Let's just see what happens. He said, and you could be hurling us towards our own destruction. It's not absolute word for word, and I can't do it as good as Jeff Goldblum can do it, but wow. I mean, what a scene. And he's got a point, all right? He's got a point. He really does. And in my opinion, if you're going to want to understand the whole point of Dominion, that's the scene you need to start with. That was really key. When I say it's about bioengineering, that's the scene I'm talking about. There you go. And you know what's really interesting about that scene? In my opinion, I think this is great for conversation. In my opinion, Dr. Malcolm is absolutely correct. As we go into these new fields of science, are we considering what we're doing in the future? Do we even care about whether or not it's the right or wrong thing to do? You're not going to believe this. Last night, I was reading a lecture by C.S. Lewis called The Abolition of Man. You guys have got to read this. I'm not as intelligent as he is. I can't state the case as forcefully as he could. But he started off by talking about the dissolution of absolute truth. And talks about how it's coming up in the classrooms and things. He says, think about it. We've always had, for thousands of years, absolute standards of right and wrong. Now, we disagreed as to the details, but we've always agreed on things like stealing, always wrong. Murder, always wrong, period. And we've always agreed about things that were always right. And he's talking about how this is disillusion. And he says, think about it. If you raise up an entire generation of people who have no standard of right or wrong, he said, all of a sudden, for the first time in human history, we have a brand new issue. Doesn't he kind of sound like Dr. Malcolm a little bit? Or does Dr. Malcolm sound like Lewis? And he says, think about it. He says, we have a race of things. He says, you can't rightly call them men or women anymore. He says, because humanity has always, he says, from birth been raised with absolute ideas of virtue, right, of right and wrong. He says, if you don't have that, he says, then all you have is oblivion. He says, and all you can ultimately produce is destruction. He says, if you're not thinking about the consequences of your actions, he says, if politicians, he says, if the man in the field of being a soldier, if scientists, if researchers are not thinking about whether or not it is right or wrong to be doing what they're doing, he said, all of a sudden, he says, essentially, you have soulless people. And it sounds just like Dr. Malcolm's speech. In my opinion, he makes such a great point. But that was the whole point, guys. That scene was so important, and so many of you missed it. I don't think you meant to. But it's not just sci-fi, guys. Yeah, the movie's science fiction, but there are times in a lot of sci-fi movies where you have definitely glimmers of truth. And in my opinion, both these guys, Lewis and especially Dr. Malcolm, were 100% correct. We're not thinking about the consequences of our actions, and if we don't watch out, We could be heading towards our own annihilation. It's a stern warning. We got to pay attention to this kind of stuff, guys. Seriously. But anyway, great scene. In my opinion, Dr. Malcolm was right. But hey, you watch the scene, or better yet, watch the movie. You tell me what you think. Leave me a comment and tell me what you think. And thanks for watching.